Hey guys, it's CodingBoy56 back at it with a new video. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to program the Ev3 sensors in episode 2 of Ev3 Fundamentals. So for those of you who don't know already, this series is going to teach you how to program from the very bottom up. So if you have no experience whatsoever, this is the perfect series for you. With that being said, let's jump into it. Oh, and by the way, my outro music kind of got copyrighted, so I'm going to be replacing that with some pretty interesting stuff. Hope you guys like it. So in last week's video, we focused heavily on the Action tab, where we would look at all these different motor commands. For example, we would input numbers or parameters, and we would expect outputs, in this case, the wheels moving. So you could input steering values, which dictates which direction the robot moves in, the speed, the revolutions or degrees or seconds, which tells you how long the robot is traveling, whether it brakes or coasts in the end. These are all inputs, and you're getting outputs from the block. But we're going to focus on this yellow sensor tab, where we can expect outputs from the block itself. So let's start off by looking at the color sensor, because it's probably one of the most commonly used sensors, especially in robotics applications, and particularly the reflected light intensity mode. Reflected light intensity is super good for detecting gradients, lines, anything involving reflected light, that kind of thing. And reflected light is basically when light hits an object, right? You're getting a certain reflected light back, with colors closer to black, or darker colors I should say, it's absorbing more of that light, so less is getting reflected. That's why you perceive it as a darker color. Whereas if you have a lighter color like yellow or white, you're getting a much higher value back, because all of that is being reflected, or almost all of it is being reflected back into the sensor. So we can see what value that is if I go into port view and we look in reflected light intensity. So I have my light sensor plugged into sensor 2 over here, and if I just scan that across this wall, for example, you can see a wide variety of sensor values going across. And it's critical that you have this at the right distance, otherwise it kind of fades away. You get an averaging effect of the values. So this scales it from a value of 0 to 100, but the actual value coming into the Ev3 brick is a value from 0 to 1023. It's a super weird number. I'll explain why that is probably in a future video, but for the sake of simplicity, we just know that it gets a value from 0 to 100. Or scales it to that, rather. So a value of 100 means white, and a value of 0 means black, or closer to black and closer to white, a darker or brighter image. So we can use that for line detection. For example, if you have a black line and a white background, you can detect exactly when you're crossing that line. You can do line following, line squaring, those kinds of intelligent programs. We can also measure color, which is another fun application of it. It's not as accurate, obviously, because there's so many different colors and shades in between what it can sense. We're going to start off by grabbing this color sensor weight block and color sensor compare color, and then we can see all the different colors in between that the Ev3 sensor can detect. So it assigns a number to each of these different colors. Since computers start by counting at 0, whereas humans count at 1, 0 is assigned to, or no color is assigned to 0, black is assigned to 1, 2 is assigned to blue, so on and so forth. I can give you an example of this actually detecting something, but just for the sake of this video not being excruciatingly long, I'm gonna skip that part. So you might be wondering, what's the point of this sensor block if I have this? Well, this allows you to plug it in and actually do something with it. So the cool part of the Ev3 programming language is that since you can drag all of these things out, you can have multiple different things that you drag out. I'll show you what I mean. See how I have all of these? It shows it in a graphical representation, which makes it super intuitive for any kind of programmer. So you basically take an output from this sensor, and then you can put it into an input for the motor. And obviously, I'm just giving one example with this. You can plug this into motor blocks for sure, but there's just so many applications with this. You can plug this into a math block and do some math with that. You can save the values in a file. Obviously, that's beyond the scope of this video, but the applications really are limitless. If you know how to use it right, you can do anything with this sensor block. So you can also measure ambient light intensity. This is less commonly used, but if you're doing some kind of experiment where you need to gather data, this might be useful for you then. Ambient light intensity just means how much light is there in the surrounding area. So it basically will change depending on the brightness of the room. So let me just try measuring with ambient light intensity over here. So this is also from a scale of 0 to 100. If I start covering my hand, right, it's immediately going to change this value. It's now much darker. Whereas if I take it off, boom, it becomes noticeably higher. So basically this block will allow us to take this value and then do anything with it, if that wasn't clear from before. Now you can also have compare, which we will talk about later. Comparing options, it basically combines two blocks into one. Compare is another block with the Ev3 software. We'll go more into that later, but it just allows you to, for example, measure reflected light intensity. I can plug that in, and it'll give me a comparison based on the result of this. So it compares this value to this value, and then returns an output based on that. In layman's terms, it's just seeing if this value is bigger than this value, say true, and if this value is not greater, send false. And then you can do a bunch of cool programming with that. But this compare option just gives you the option of doing that within a single block itself. Mind you, this is useful by itself in many cases, but as I said, it just allows you to combine it into a single block. So compare, I said, it just compares the values. Same thing as this, but with a compare. So I'm not going to go over every single one of those because it should be fairly obvious. You can play around with it and sort of find out by yourself. So this calibration option, I find it a little bit weird because I prefer to write my own calibration programs, but this allows you to set a minimum and maximum. So what calibration means is it tells the robot the range of data that you can get. To kind of dumb it down, if let's say I have a value of 80 and a value of 20, the highest and lowest points in this room, well, I can sort of use that range much more effectively by making that 80 my new 100 and that 20 my new 0 point. And that's basically what this calibration does. So it'll set your minimum and your maximum and make that the new 100 and 0. So that way 50 will be exactly between black and white. And reset, it just resets the sensor as it says, kind of refreshes it. Now, I only focus on the light sensor for this video, but the logic applies for all of these different sensors. I encourage you to play around with all these different sensors, and then you can sort of figure out by yourself. I'll explain 2 or 3 more sensors just so you guys get the hang of it, but as I said, just play around with it. So these Brit Buttons are slightly different from the light sensors in the fact that they're not analog, they're actually digital. Analog means that you can get a variety of values, so you're getting value from 0 to 1023, as I said previously, which is scaled to a value of 0 and 100 to 100. You're getting a range of values. Whereas with the Brit Button, all you can detect really is it on, is it off, is it being pressed, or is it being released. Now the Ev3 software does allow you to see if it's being bumped, and what I mean by bumped is it's being pressed and released, but I found from personal experience that it actually is quite faulty, it doesn't work all the time. So in those scenarios, I usually check if it's being pressed, released, and being pressed again. Or release, press, and release is what I meant to say. So let me just give you an example of that. In compare Brit Buttons, we get to see which buttons we select. You can choose multiple, any combination really, and then you see which state it is in. If it's released, pressed, or bumped. You can kind of see that being indicated by the arrow in both directions. It's being pressed and released. And then you get a result from here, which tells you if it is indeed being pressed, or if it isn't. It returns a true or false from there. And it also gives you the useful information of a button ID, so it tells you which button is being pressed. In the case that you are using multiple buttons, it's really useful then. So that's the compare option, but in the measure, it just gives you the button ID. So anything I'm pressing right now, it just gives you the button ID. So I'm also going to look at the gyro sensor real quick, because the reason I'm giving you all these different sensors is because these work differently, whereas the rest work pretty similar to the light sensor. The gyro sensor gives you a value from 0 to unlimited potentially, because I actually don't have it on me at the moment, but it basically outputs an angle value. So if you mount it on your robot, right, and the orientation of it changes, it's going to return different values, and it's noted in degrees. So a value from 0 to 360. It does not include rollover though. And rollover is basically if I, for example, turn this robot 180 degrees, right, clockwise, the moment I exceed that, it doesn't roll over to, for example, negative 90 or negative 80. It keeps going. It goes to 270, goes to 360 even. It'll keep going onwards. But it can detect negative. If I were to turn it counterclockwise, for example, it would roll over negative. So it allows me to do that same angle, compare. So I could compare if the angle is less than or greater than or equal to all that. And then it gives me a result. Now the gyro sensor actually measures rate, not angle. And what rate is how fast the angle is changing per second. So for example, a rate of 5 would mean that it's changing in 5 degrees per second. You can actually measure rate and angle. It'll give you both. The thing about the Ev3 gyro sensor is that it's super inaccurate in the fact that there's a lot of lag. There's lag, and there's also the fact that it can easily drift. Drifting is caused by, well, if I were to unplug the sensor, right, and then you can see it pop out of the screen there, right over here, and I started spinning around with it, right? Then it now thinks that this is a new normal. This is the 0. So when I immediately bring it to 0, it thinks that now it's spinning around. So that can mess it up super easily. I haven't found a solid way to fix it, but there are some tutorials online. I'm not sure how valid they are, but try checking those out. The reset value just sends the current value to 0. It doesn't fix any kind of drift or lag issue. The infrared sensor, that's pretty interesting actually. I have it on me right now. It works pretty similar to an ultrasonic, not in the way that it gets the data, but it outputs the same kind of data. So I could just shine this to something, and it's giving me a value you can see over there, from 0 to 100. What I really loved about the NXT ultrasonic sensor over here is that it would give me a solid value from 0 to, I believe it was 150, I think. It gives you in centimeters, which is really useful, whereas this is kind of a scaled value. That's nice and all, but it isn't really that useful, unless you manually scale it. So this heading value also gives you the direction of the infrared beacon. And the cool part of this is that you can actually control this with the remote. I misplaced that, I'll find it later, but it'll tell you which direction it is. So it gives you a value from, I believe, negative 25 to positive 25. It is pretty cool. And it also tells you which channel you're receiving from. This detected is just a positive, sorry, not a positive, what am I saying? It's a logic parameter, which just tells you if it is in fact receiving any values. But apart from that, everything else is fairly similar to the light sensor. It just returns a value in a certain range. Motor encoder values, that's pretty useful. It just gives you the degrees of rotations. This value you see over here, I'm adjusting the wheels. You can see that being sloshed around. It just goes unlimited. It's pretty useful. But I think that's pretty much all you need to know with the sensors. You can kind of experiment on your own. And with that being said, cue the outro. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching that video. If you did, leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this every week. Or, every month? 2 months? Who knows? Enjoy the outro, it's gonna be interesting. See ya.